You all served on the School Finance Commission, which all the way back at the beginning, people were like, we really need to study this issue. We've been studying this issue for like 100 years. But in fact, you all spent a lot of good, productive time traveling around the state, hashing this issue out, listening to people, talking to people. And now we're finally at go time in terms of the House and Senate proposals that have been put before us. And while there are differences, there are big things in common. Beginning, it appears, with the top line number, which we'll have to unpack it over the course of this conversation, but is $9 billion. That appears to be a point of agreement, whatever points of disagreement there are. Representative Bernal, Senator West, is $9 billion the right number from inside? Representative Bernal first. Is $9 billion the right number?
It's a good number. I think it could be a little more, because if we're being honest, the plan is to do a lot, but let's say that we get everything that we want on either side. I don't think that any one of us could say, we're done, let's not revisit it the session after that. There's always more to do. I think it's a very, very good starting place. It's a tremendous building block.
Yeah.
We can do a lot with it. So right now, absolutely, it's the right number.
Senator West, the number was initially less. There was some discussion of it being closer to $6 billion in total, and then all of a sudden last week, boop, it popped back up to $9 billion.
And I think that's a good starting point.
Starting point.
Right.
Right.
I mean, this is the way I look at this. Is that, yes, we have agreement to put more money into our public school system. The question is it sustainable? And I guess we'll get into it.
Well, that's the question. Do you have the money to do the $9 billion in the budget now? I mean, you know, the breakdown of the House plan is $6.3 billion for school finance. We'll talk about what that actually means in a second. $2.7 billion for property tax. The Senate program, to the degree that we understand what it is, and I'm still, I confess, a little bit in the dark, and I'm paid to know this stuff.
And I will educate you.
You will educate me, or you won't? You will? I hope you will. Please educate me. My understanding is $4 billion for teacher compensation, $2.3 billion for school finance reform, and the very same $2.7 billion for property tax to get to $9 billion, right?
Right.
So do you have the money, Senator West, right now in the budget to do that? Where's it coming from?
Do we have the money in the budget is the question. We are working on putting the money in the budget to do exactly that. And frankly, all of us know, especially those that have been in Austin, recognize that this bill, in terms of what will ultimately end up coming down, won't come down until conference committee.
Right.
That's when we're going to be taking the monies and making certain.
We're in the first inning here.
That's all this is first inning stuff.
Right. And do you have money in the House budget to pay for this? I mean, you guys are kumbayaing us to death by getting on the same page on the budget. You all apparently think you got the money in the budget to pay for this.
Yes.
You're not going to give me anything, are you?
Well, the answer is yes.
Okay, fine. Forgive me for being a little skeptical that it's that easy. Mr. Williams, you are outside the building. Ms. Conley Johnson, you are outside the building. Todd, you've been banging the drum for more thoughtful investment, not just throwing money at the problem, but more thoughtful investment in this issue. And you were part of this School Finance Commission effort, which, among other things, did not put a number, a price tag at the end of the day on how much it would cost to fix the system. So I'm asking you to do the same as what I asked these guys to do, react to the number. Is $9 billion the right number?
I would say, and echo what they said, that it is a great start. I'd like to try and put it in perspective, if I could. $6 billion is roughly $3 billion per year, because it's $6 billion for the biennium.
Right.
$3 billion a year against a $60 billion budget is about 5%.
5% increase. Right.
So 5% increase in the face of the last 4 years has really been no increase in funding is a great start. And given
and so we're clear, it's over and above enrollment growth. So you're not simply using that money to pay for enrollment growth. It's over and above.
Correct.
Right.
So I think it is a great start. But given our outcomes today, we talked about this last night, and 1 in 5 8th graders getting a post-secondary degree by the age of 24, 12% if you're low income. I don't think any of us believe that simple 5% increase in funding is going to say, as Representative Bernal says, we're done.
Yeah.
It's a great start, but I think what's equally important are what are the systemic reforms that are also part of that bill, and what will ultimately be the final legislation that I think has the real ability to move outcomes.
And so we're going to be taking the state's share of public education through this rebalancing of the seesaw. We're going to be taking it up from the mid-high 30s, where it is right now, sort of mid-30s, up to just about 40, maybe a little bit beyond 40%, but not to 50%, not to where it was in 2006. But it's progress. It's the first couple of steps in the path, but it's not the entire path.
That's exactly right. And we need to do more at the state level.
Yeah.
We need to do more at the state level. But again, all of us agree that this is a great first step towards reforming how we fund public education in the state of Texas.
Ms. Conley Johnson, you are inside the boiler room, in essence, of public education as the CFO in one of the big urban school districts, and you understand that a number like $9 billion has real-world consequences. So how do you feel about $9 billion as a number and how it affects your piece specifically?
I'm greatly encouraged by the $9 billion. Like everyone said it here, is sort of the first significant step towards infusing dollars into a system that's greatly needed. I mean, the pent-up needs were so severe. I mean, when you think about it, school districts have had to absorb over 6%, nearly 7% of inflation over the last 5 to 8 years. They cut $5 billion out in 2011. So most districts weren't fully restored, and you add the fact that the cost of goods and services are going up. Wages for our teachers are greatly behind where we need to be in terms of a competitive market space. In Austin, we're competing with, for the same talent pool when you have Apple and Dell moving into these communities, and then our teachers and our employees are facing the consequences of not even being able to afford the communities that they serve. And so most school districts have been deficit spending, spending out of their reserves, which we know is not a sustainable solution to our perennial woes of having shortfalls. And so this bill, I think we did a lot in terms of a community to sort of get behind the Finance Commission's work. We wanted to move beyond the behaviors of the past where we had the circular firing squad. Did I get everything that I wanted that would sort of put Austin in the best position? No, but I think that across the board, for all school districts, it's a win for us. And I really give a lot of accolades to the commission members, the Texas state leadership, in making this first step. And I think that taxpayers will benefit as well. It mitigates some of the growth, some of the burden that local taxpayers were shouldering. And so I think this is a pivotal juncture in where we are in terms of really fixing school finance, and I'm really happy about the work.
And as a practical matter, I wanted to come to recapture later as a part of the overhaul that is in process now, provided you all come to some agreement and move forward. You're not going to get rid of recapture, as the speaker predicted at the beginning of the session. You would not eliminate recapture, but that you would mitigate some of the ill effects of recapture. Ms. Conley Johnson, the fact is that Austin, according to the runs that came out yesterday, Austin would see its recapture payment decline by $194 million in the next year. What would have been a $670 million, roughly, recapture payment, is that right?
Yes, yes. No, we get down to 600, roughly around 800 million.
So it would have been actually,
closer, yeah.
I had fooled myself into thinking that
at
the news was better. So the
587 we get down to.
So so the good news is only 587 million.
Only
in
half,
recapture.
just over $500 million.
Right.
I mean, the next few years we would have been paying close to $1 billion, Austin taxpayers.
Right, but so you're saving just under 200 million. Dallas is saving just under 175 million. I kept looking for a Houston number in the news accounts of this yesterday, but presumably Houston, which has had its own recapture battles, is also going to see savings. So there are legitimately real-world consequences to all of that as it happens. I want to talk, Representative Bernal, Senator West, about what the legislation in play does. Again, accepting Senator West that we really don't know what's up with the Senate bill right now. Right, we have an introduced bill, but it seems like the action is primarily with the House bill at the moment. Is that right?
Well, yes, to answer the question, based on conversations that I think that have been had in the Capitol, that may end up being the vehicle that the Senate utilizes in order to place what it believes should be a part of.
I read in the
change.
Texas Tribune, which I believe to be real news and not fake news,
Why would you believe that?
Chairman Taylor. I'm inviting trouble here with that. That Chairman Taylor told our reporter Kia Collier last week that he believes that Senate Bill 4 will likely not go forward on its own, and that in all likelihood HB 3 is going to be the mechanism.
And that's okay. And that's okay as long as we take what we believe should be in there and then ultimately have a conversation in conference and get it right.
So let's talk about what's in there. So the sort of high points, Representative Bernal, is you're increasing the state's funding amount minimum per student from $5,140 to $6,030, so about $900 increase in the allotment. You're changing funding weights to give schools extra money for economically disadvantaged students and learning impairments, funding full-day pre-K for low-income students, and then there is the corresponding lowering of property tax rates for school districts. That's all in the plan as of right now.
Yes.
Right. Are you good on the Senate side with everything I just said? Raising the allotment, tweaking the weights, full-day pre-K. Is there generally agreement about that?
Conceptually, yes.
Yeah.
I mean, now what do
Devil's
I mean?
in the details.
I mean, the devil's always in the details. You take, the commission talked about a spectrum approach in terms of comp ed. And I want to make certain that we maintain that spectrum approach,
Right.
and then make certain that those dollars that come into a school district are used, they're not supplanted, but they supplement monies going to those various schools. That's real important to me.
Yeah, and this is consistent, Representative Bernal, with the conversations you had over the interim.
It's consistent with the conversations. It's also consistent with what's in the bill, but because we've never done it before,
Right.
I look forward to the Senate looking at it to make sure that we get it right, because we do want that money to follow the students. And in this way, we're doing more than just focusing on districts. We're going even more granular to campuses and students.
Let me add, and I don't know whether it's in the bill, but I think there's some mechanism in the bill that address a major concern that I have. We put all this money into our public school system, and then we say in the future we're going to make certain that the basic allotment, let's just say 6,000.
Right.
The question is, how do we make certain we maintain that allotment going forward? And so what I want to make certain, and I think there's a mechanism in the House bill, that there's some sort of governor in there. So if you already have school districts, already have pre-approved tax rates, and then we bring it down 4 cents, that if for some reason the state doesn't live up to its responsibility, you remember last time we did this in 2006? Different story. Okay. That you would be able to access pre-approved tax rate dollars in order to at least make certain that you're able to have a basic allotment equal to what's in this current bill.
Well, that's
going forward.
That's the concern, is it not, Nicole? The fact is that you all at the level of school district and school, you need a predictable plan.
Yes.
If the legislature decides to put $9 billion in this year and they commit to an increase in the allotment, and then all of a sudden the economy goes south, all of a sudden these good times we've been having, the longest uninterrupted expansion in the economy in this state in a long time, suddenly people keep saying this is the year when it's going to turn down. This is the year, let's hope it doesn't. But if it should turn down and all of a sudden that money is not available, how do you unwind that as a practical matter, right?
Right. It would be extremely difficult. I mean, it's kind of what we're living with today. I mean, we're going to have to go into austerity planning, and we're going to face many of the programs that we know are good investments for our schools will be vulnerable, which is one of the points that we discussed during this School Finance Commission, that we know that there's successful strategies for supporting our students better. But it was the sustainability of the funding that provided the greatest risk and concern, and which is why I came up with $15 billion worth of revenue ideas.
Right. Well,
for them to access at some point
Hopefully.
later down the road.
Well, in essence, Representative Bernal, you're not only committing to $9 billion now, but the implication is that you're committing to that $9 billion in perpetuity.
Right, that's what I was going to say, was
Right.
that what's really, really interesting and exciting about this is that we're baking these things into the formula.
Right.
So right now, the basic allotment in statute is X. We're funding it at sort of X plus Y.
Right.
But in statute, we're going to change the basic allotment. And so I think people keep asking the question, where is the money going to come from, as if there's a pie that is the budget, and then school finance is sort of a separate pie. And I think what we're doing in this bill is taking this and forcing it into here. So if you want to change it, if you want to defund it, someone's got to file a bill, pass it out of the chamber they're in to the next chamber, up to the governor, have him sign it. That's harder.
It's not impossible, but it's also politically complicated.
Well, you don't just leave it up to appropriators if things get tight. The law will require that you fund the schools at this level.
Todd, for purposes of this conversation, I'm just going to keep calling you Real World Todd. Because you don't operate in the fantasy land that is the Capitol, and you don't actually live inside of a school district. You're the guy on the outside saying this needs to be fixed in some way, and you're thinking about it in sort of a different context. So from the perspective of the real world, does it make sense for that $9 billion to be allocated this way, and for the assumption or the implication to be that this is in perpetuity? In the real world, can you commit to that in perpetuity?
I can certainly commit to that fact that that $9 billion should be in perpetuity. I would argue that if we can continue to show results from the wise investment of this $9 billion, that we have built the political will to invest more.
Right.
If we continue to focus on where we've still got, if I would call it, leaks in our educational pipeline, where do we spend more money with strategies? I think I spent a lot of time on both sides of the aisle in this process talking to people. And the thing that is universal that I find is that people are not opposed to investing significant more money if they think it's going to make a difference.
There has to be a return on the investment, right?
And that's why I think, if you think about it, we've been fighting for full-day pre-K for a long time. But when we started focusing on the fact that only 40% of our kids are meeting the state standard in third grade reading, all of a sudden the dialogue completely changed. Because everybody could understand that third grade reading of that level is not what we need in Texas.
Right. And you have 92 pre-filed amendments for the debate over the...
are they all his amendments?
Over House Bill.
No, I don't.
Not all yours.
No, they're not.
Right, but they're also not all Matt Schaefer's. I mean, the reality is this is not Team Blue or Team Red asserting itself in the amendment process. The fact is you have more than 100 at last count, more than 100 House members who were signed on to support this legislation.
Right.
So the question of whether it passes is really not a question at all.
All right, it's what it looks like when we're done with it.
It looks like it's going to go pretty well. I mentioned the $2.7 billion of the $9 billion, Senator West and Representative Bernal, is associated with the property tax piece of this. I'm remembering last session, the no one without the other, courtesy of the Lieutenant Governor, was school choice, however we define school choice. And I know there's a different view depending upon who you are and how you define that. But he said, if we don't do school choice, we're not going to do school finance, and lo and behold, didn't do school choice, didn't do school finance. This time, the no one without the other, more in pragmatic terms, is if you don't do property tax reform, you're not going to do public ed, because the necessary condition to reforming school finance is to rebalance the seesaw, right? So what's up with the property tax reform piece of this? Are you confident that we're going to get there?
I think we're going to get there. The question is whether or not the two architects are going to be able to agree on something to bring to both bodies that, that we're going to be able to
But didn't you
support.
just tell us that on school finance, presumably on every bit of legislation, that it's all going to get done in conference? So they don't have to agree now, they just have to agree eventually.
Well, eventually they're going to have to agree, and then the body's going to have to vote on it. Right. I think that there is a consensus that we need to make sure we have some sort of property tax reduction in the state of Texas. We know that in terms of funding our public schools, given the great reliance that we have on local property taxes, when I get my property tax bill, over 50% of that property tax bill is schools.
Now, the Senate plan right now, Senator West, does not exempt school districts from the property tax threshold.
That's exactly right.
Revision, but in the House, it does.
Right.
And that is not an insignificant sticking point, right?
Well, that's exactly why they have to continue to talk.
Right. Nicole, should the school districts be exempt?
Yes.
Yes? Mm-hmm. Why? You're Texans like the rest of us. Why should, we're all, why should we make the argument why there should be carve-outs? Why should we treat different categories or classes of folks differently as it relates to this threshold? I know that the community colleges already seem to be out, and there's some public safety stuff that seems to be out, but how does this work? It's like Swiss cheese if there's all these holes in it.
Well, I think for school districts, right, there's a formula that sort of determines our entitlement. And I think that is the one sort of core difference in terms of how we're funded versus other sort of entities and how they're funded. We don't have a lot of tools in our toolkit to sort of generate revenue and entitlements. We're not like cities and counties that have other ways to access monies and fees. We're heavily reliant upon a formula that has to sort of dictate how we're funded. And in that regards, it requires a different treatment for school districts. So
your perspective as the CFO of one of the largest school districts in the state is if you are subject to this cap, the way that everybody else is, you cannot functionally operate the district.
Correct. Well, it depends on where you're at. I mean, we could certainly operate with the taxes we collect in Austin, but presumably across the state of Texas,
Right.
our entitlement has to be protected. And so we have to ensure that we have the appropriate resources to operate our schools. And these tax caps could, in my mind, they're going to erode capacity to satisfy the need to fund all of our public schools adequately. And it would just result in sort of dire programming shaves off down the road. And so I just don't believe that caps are appropriate for school districts.
Todd, the fact is that wherever property taxes land at the local level, all that does is push the other side of it, which is the state's funding obligation up. So wherever you land on the property tax side, the state's going to come in and pick up the rest of the tab, isn't it?
You know, every time we used to talk about in the commission, well, the state needs to fund its share. Well, the state is us, right? The question is which pocket
Yeah,
is going
aren't
to
these
pay for
all
it.
tax dollars? It's
These are all tax dollars.
left
and
pocket or right pocket, but same pair of pants.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's amazing after spending all this time on the School Finance Commission. I just spent the last week traveling some southern states, and I was just always focusing on sales tax. What was the rate compared to what it is in Texas, you know, for
Right.
example?
So have you come around to the idea that our taxes should be higher as a consequence of traveling to other states because we're such a low tax burden state?
I think we found.
You may get kicked off any
That's
future
okay.
commissions.
That's
if you say
okay.
it.
I think that's okay. I think if we're using those extra proceeds to invest in the future of Texas, I'd do it all day long.
What happened on teacher pay? What has happened so far, and where is all this going? I mean, there are very few cliffhangers in this kumbaya session so far, but I can't figure out where this is all going, Senator West. The Senate has passed a bill unanimously to give every teacher in the state of Texas a $5,000 pay increase. High performers, low performers, and everybody in between.
I think where it's going to go is that teachers are going to get a pay raise, first of all.
Right. Are they
Okay?
going to get
the
that
first
pay- are
one?
they going to get
The first
that pay
one in a
raise?
long time.
Yeah, but will they get that pay raise?
Well, again, it gets down to exactly what the negotiations will be between the House and the Senate. Let me say this: I want to make certain that those teachers that are going to our schools in need of improvement, that we provide a bonus for them. So we need to do that in order to make certain we deal with some of the issues we dealt with.
That's different than giving every teacher a raise. What you're talking about is,
In addition to
in
making
addition
certain.
to that, incentivize the best teachers to locate themselves or be located in the lowest performing schools.
That's exactly right.
Similar to what happened in
I want to make certain also that
Yeah.
we provide an incentive for students that are in college to pick the teaching profession and not have to starve being a teacher. So from that vantage point, I want to make certain
base pay so that it's more
base pay
attractive.
and also try to find a way where teachers can make over 6 figures.
Right. You do not have that plan in your bill currently.
We don't have an across the board. pay
Across the
raise.
board. Why not? Why do you hate teachers?
Partially because one of the things that I really learned is that
Partially,
the state.
oh, you shouldn't answer it that way. Don't answer it that way.
No.
You get a do-over.
Don't worry.
Do-
we'll
do
we'll
over,
edit
do
that
over.
out in post. Don't worry. You should say, no, I don't hate teachers.
I don't like the idea of mandating a $1 amount pay raise. One of the things that I learned, I represent the urban core of San Antonio. So when I think of education, I think of my own in that place and that area. The state's very different. The state's diverse. There are some districts that start their teachers off at $32,000, others that start their teachers off at $52,000. An across-the-board pay raise that leaves out a lot of the other people who are involved in education isn't as thoughtful. I think we want to leave some discretion. I do believe, however, that in the meeting of the minds between the Senate and the House, there will be something that does touch everyone the right way. There is tremendous consensus, however. So I think we'll get there. I'm not sure what it'll look like, but we'll get there. It's not either or. But there's tremendous consensus on this idea that you should incent or provide some sort of bonus or a salary increase to teachers to go and teach in the schools that have the hardest time keeping their staff, that are not, so you make sure they're not full of young, inexperienced teachers. I mean, only here do we meet need with inexperience. In every other instance, that's a recipe for disaster. And honestly, this is an issue that's about as old as Brown versus Board, right? So we've let this continue on. And I know we're going to get to merit pay at a certain point. I know we're getting to that.
You mean in the conversation?
Right,
I'm giving you a 10-second warning.
Right, but I want to preempt that a little bit and say that at a minimum, I believe you start here first. It should not be, and here's where we differ a little bit. It should not be that as a district, let's say SEISD, it should not be that SEISD has to adopt a district-wide merit pay system first, and then has to figure out how to get the best teachers to the schools that need it the most. We should have done that second part decades ago. And so I think that's where there's consensus is, here are schools that are struggling. They're almost always surrounded by generational poverty. We have not found a way to triage that. We all agree across the board, every group, every hearing, to do that.
Let me just add this. Yeah. When you look at the Dallas experience, the ACE program in Dallas, over the history of that program, 33% of the teachers involved in the ACE program make over $70,000 a year.
Right. So by doing that, you have in fact increased the base pay in essence, right?
Right, and we focused it with
the average pay. Right. Yeah. Senator West, I asked Representative Bernal why he hates teachers. Let me ask you why you hate superintendents. Because the fact is, local control used to be something we liked in this state. Don't you want to give the districts discretion to decide how those additional dollars you give them can best be spent? Maybe every district doesn't want to give every one of its teachers a $5,000 pay increase. Maybe those dollars can be deployed differently in service to making those schools great. So why do you hate local control?
First of all, I don't hate superintendents. I don't hate local control.
You answered it better than he answered it. I will say that. Good for you.
I mean, but we have to work together. I mean, there's certain things that we want to achieve as a state. Okay, so we have state goals. And so we need to make certain that we provide the resources locally and indicate by directive how we feel about certain issues and make certain that the districts understand what we want to see have happen. I believe in local control. I want to make certain that resources at the local level are also distributed in the manner they need to in order to accomplish the goals and objectives that we have as a state. As an example, over the 20-something years I've been here, we've always talked about low-performing schools.
Right.
All right? And so the questions then become whether or not the superintendents and the local school boards, when they divvy up the money locally, are doing it in a manner that provides the resources to the schools that need improvement.
Need it the most.
Right.
Nicole, you understand because you are responsible as the finance person for how this money gets distributed. What would be the best way to solve the problem of inadequate teacher pay, with an across-the-board pay increase or something that's tied to performance?
Those are your only two choices.
Well, you know, I mean, look, the fact is you can say that the answer to either or is yes, right? I mean, it could be some combination of both, or it could be a third thing, but I'm asking you because you understand this from the inside of the operation, the guts of it. What's the best way to do it?
Well, I think obviously, I mean, it's a combination of both, right? One size fits all doesn't even work purely in Austin, let alone across the entire state. I mean, we have gaps to fill in terms of getting base teacher pay up to where it needs to be so people can have livable wages, yes. Teachers are the core of what we do. They're, like my son, he says, they're my everything, right? They save my life, they save lives every day. We know that most school districts, no superintendent worth his salt is gonna say, I don't wanna pay teachers more. We absolutely wanna pay teachers more. We wanna pay them 6 figures. However, like in a district like Austin, half of the staff that we hire supports our teachers in the classrooms. We have food service workers, bus drivers, instructional aides, which teachers will always tell you, I can't do my job without the assistance of others that support me every day in the classroom.
Now, not all of those non-instructional staff are subject to the across-the-board increase, right? There are some, but not all.
Correct, and some but not all. So we need to have the flexibility to address pay in a way that really best serves our local school needs. And I don't think that across the board is going to really cure the issues that we're seeing with competitive wages. We need a hybrid of the two. We have strategic compensation in Austin. Most school districts are trying to move that way towards adopting policies to incentivize the kind of behavior and results that they want. But we have to address the core, but at the same time, we have to pay the teachers that are doing exceptional very differently. And so it requires both.
Todd, you have been a big advocate, unapologetically, for pay for performance. You were an advocate on the commission. You're an advocate post-commission work, right? Mm-hmm. It was in the original House bill. It's not in the House bill now. Are you crestfallen?
I will live another day, I guess. Right. Listen, in the original House bill, the best teachers working in the most challenged schools could make $30,000 to $35,000 more on top of their salary today, which would get them to $80,000, $90,000, $100,000
Right, the
salaries.
governor articulated a goal, and not just the governor, of trying to get teachers up, the best teachers up to six-figure salaries, and that was one way to do it.
Yep.
Right.
I just think, listen, you talk to any superintendent in this state, and they'll tell you we have a teacher crisis. They will tell you that it is harder and harder each and every year to find people of the quality that we want to go into our classrooms. Higher ed, people who are majoring in education has been going down every single year in the state. Commissioner Morath mentioned last night that this was the first year that nationwide the majority of parents were advising their kids not to go into education. If we don't figure out a way to provide significant raises in a meaningful way, not $500 a year, but $5,000 a year for great teachers, we are not going to improve outcomes.
So that sounds like you're for the across the board.
No, I'm for a wage that ultimately everybody can live on, and then for our best teachers, I want to pay them like rock stars.
Yeah.
And that percentage could be a pretty high percentage.
What about outcomes-based funding generally? So pay for performance is one way to think about accountability tied to funding or pay. But more broadly, we've had a conversation for many years, Senator West, about outcomes-based funding. Let's not pay based on inputs, let's pay based on outputs. This room is probably divided just based on last night. If that room is this room is probably divided on the merits of that. What do you think?
I don't have a problem if, as you said, we've discussed this year after year after year. And so that kind of shows exactly where we are. We're divided on it. But the reality is this, and I support teachers. I think my record is pretty good supporting. I want to see some performance because I get sick and tired of being sick and tired of when we begin to look at schools in need of improvement, they continue to be in need of improvement year after year after year.
Yeah.
And so to that extent, we've got to make certain that we provide as many tools as possible, including outcome-based funding, in order to change those results.
Senator, what outcomes? Be specific. What outcomes? And assess through what instrument?
Well, I mean, whatever instrument we utilize in order to assess everyone else and judge everyone else, we've got to also use that for purposes that we have to also engage in those activities to get the students to be able to be successful with those students. And let me finish that. Let me finish. Yeah. I want to also see the students graduating from high school. I want to see them college ready. I want to see them going on to college.
So it's multiple outcomes.
Let me finish.
Multiple outcomes, yeah.
You want me to answer the question?
I thought you had to run off to the Senate. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
All right. I want to see them college ready.
Yes.
I want to see them persist, and I want to see them graduate from college.
Yeah. So there's a series, a list of outcomes.
Sure.
It would not be any one outcome.
Right.
There's a lot of anxiety, as you know, Senator, as you know, Representative, about the STAR test.
Yes.
As a driver of, the grading system that the TEA now has in effect, but of so many other conversations that relate to outcomes-based funding, accountability, and all that. What is the right? Is it the right? Is it part of a mix of assessments? What's the right way to think about outcomes?
I mean, it depends how you define it. You're using it very broadly, right?
Deliberately, I want you to fill in the gray space.
So,
the white space,
if we're looking for for example, if we do funding for the best teachers to go to the schools that need the most help, and we don't see a change in those schools in any sort of measure, right? Assuming nothing's wrong with the STAR, I'm not sure I'm quite there yet, but assuming nothing's wrong with the STAR, you should see it in every measure we use. If you don't, then you have to respond. That's different than I think when we talk about outcome measures this session, we're talking about, I think, this idea of third grade reading, STAR performance, funding, pre-K. That's a very different conversation than whether or not the inputs are producing the kind of results we want at a campus level. So I just want to distinguish the two.
Yeah. Nicole, does the district you work for like the idea of being judged on the basis of performance and seeing your funding tied to that, or is there a problem with that from the school district perspective?
I think school districts are ready to be accountable. They already are every day. I do think that and I'm going to speak for me personally as a CFO, I have a challenge with funding school districts based on outcomes, primarily because the availability of programming for future students is dependent upon the performance of the prior students. And when we have students show up every day with different needs, and we have to serve them. And depending on the measure, we know that there are going to be some kids who may not ever reach the results when Commissioner Rath says he should reach those results. And so my worry about outcomes-based funding is that we still have to operate school districts, we still have to serve every student, and the funding availability should not necessarily be tied to the performance of the previous students.
You know, Todd, we had a friend from the education community last night in response to something that the commissioner said, tweeted, great, we're going to tie funding to outcomes, meaning that we're going to tie the funding of public education to the performance on one test of an 8-year-old.
I think I know that tweet.
Yeah. Well, so is she wrong?
Well, here's what I would say. Probably my biggest disappointment, and I guess my hope for the future, let me just say it differently, is that the ultimate responsibility of a K through 12 system is to make sure that every child graduates, is ready for the next level, is supported in that level, and they ultimately complete and get a degree.
Right.
If we don't, at a minimum, incentivize and reward that, I think we have failed in that regard. And remember, outcomes-based funding was 1% of a district's total funding. We never want it to be so egregious that if it fell slightly, that all of a sudden you have to be cutting people. You wouldn't have to be. But I've seen districts respond to, for example, putting forth a lot of innovative programs to make sure they got students to not go to charters and come to the ISDs because they wanted that revenue.
Yeah.
So they respond to revenue. And I just feel like if we don't have that ultimate responsibility for getting kids ready, we are not serving our kids well.
We're going to go to Representative Bernal here in a second. We're going to go to audience questions, though, from my colleague Emily Goldstein. If you have not already texted or tweeted questions, make sure you do it, Representative.
Well, I want to point out that there's sort of an identity crisis that we're having here, and we haven't. One of the issues that people had is that we haven't thought this all the way through, right? So in one instance, we're saying if you're a student or you're a campus that needs lots of help, has been failing for a long time, here's more money and more resources to do well. And on the flip side, we're saying if it turns out that you're a campus or a student that doesn't do well, we're going to take money away, right? Because you're not performing.
It's kind of outcomes-based punishment as opposed to outcomes-based funding.
Right, and no one's ever talked about what it looks like in the event you do give a school money, they do well, and then they don't. What happens? We never thought it all the way through. Do we take money away? Do we actually give them more? Like, what's the triage mechanism? We haven't had that conversation, and I think that's in large part what makes people uncomfortable. At a minimum, I think there might be some agreement on the concept, but in the ideas that were deployed in concrete terms, it gave people hesitancy because we couldn't figure out how it was supposed to work in the event it didn't go the way we wanted it to.
Right.
And I'm hoping that we don't waste time this session and take that off the table. That should be a part of this conversation, and we need to come up with some ideas on how to deal with that issue. I agree with you wholeheartedly.
Yeah. Quickly, Senator, so all of a sudden everybody loves pre-K. I said this to our panel last night. What the hell happened? We went to bed one night, woke up in the morning, and now everybody loves pre-K, and we're all on board with full-day pre-K.
And people are listening, finally.
Is that what it is?
I mean, the reality is many of us have been advocating that for years.
No, I get that.
And people have, the leadership, frankly, education leadership that's been on that side, we've been saying it over and over again. Now, all of a sudden, people are listening. I give credit to former President Bush when he was here, and we talked about if students couldn't read by the 3rd grade, they didn't need to be promoted. And initially, when he said that, I said, over my dead body, are we going to hold kids back? But guess what? After sitting down talking to people, I agreed with that. We've got to make certain that from pre-K all the way to the 3rd grade that these kids are ready. Right. And they become vessels being able to absorb the knowledge necessary in order to persist through our education system.
Are you going to properly fund, now having accepted the principle of full-day pre-K, are you going to properly fund it?
You're talking about Governor West?
I'm talking about will the legislature, I'm talking about will the legislature, both sides signed by the governor, ultimately fund full-day pre-K at an adequate level, or is this going to be more of a show trial?
And I can't answer the question. Will I be advocating it? Yes.
Yeah. You think you're going to be able to get there?
I think that's one thing that both sides agree on without hesitation. If we do anything this session, it's do that. I'm confident, I'm hopeful that we can do that.
I agree.
Todd, last question before we go to the audience. Why is this so hard? I mean, I think we've seen over the last 50 minutes that there are so many complicated aspects to this. I keep asking myself over the many years of witnessing this debate, is it a politics problem or is it an economics problem? It's kind of both, but it seems almost more like a politics problem than an economics problem.
Exactly.
I agree. You know, it's interesting. I've been watching these sessions for multiple years now, and we have lots of great advocates. We've got superintendents. We've got teacher groups. We've got education advocates, including my organization, who all purport to represent the best interests of students. The one voice that we don't have at the table every session are students.
Well, they don't have lobbyists, for one thing.
They don't have lobbyists. They don't vote. And there's 5.4 million of them. And so for me, the best advocate for their voice, if they're not at that table, is what's the data say? How many of our kids are getting a degree? How many kids are succeeding? And that's got to be our North Star.
Got it. Emily, you've got some questions from the audience. Fire away. Nope. You can use your outside voice, and I'm happy to repeat the question if you want.
We have a question from Patricia in Dallas.
Yes?
And she would like to know, what is the reality of a single-issue legislature in continuing this work next session?
Right.
We're many billions short of the national average for education spending. How do we assure that this bill is more than just a start?
Right. Well, we got into this a little bit earlier. Is this going to be a persistent thing? But I think the principle of this question is interesting. You know, it's easy to focus on public education and do meaningful work when you say at the beginning of the session, this is the only issue, right? We had a transportation session in 2015. We had a water session in 2013. It took the intense focus of the legislature on those issues to solve those thorny challenges, effectively never to be heard from again. How do we know that having roadblocked the agenda this time, Representative Bernal on public ed, that you're going to go into next session and it's going to be a something else session and no one's going to be focused on this?
I don't think that'll ever happen. I think that in many cases, when you do polling, when you're block walking, when you're interacting with your community, you realize that public ed's been an issue for them all along. And now that if we get something done, they'll want more. Also, because a lot of the programs we're talking about aren't going to be completely fleshed out in 2 years. To the extent that they work, the community and educators and the rest of us are going to want more of it. So we'll have to build on the things that actually work.
And let me say this. It is so important as we go through this exercise of changing our funding system in public education that a significant component is sustainability. Sustainability. We can't do all of this and not have a clear path that shows that the funding can in fact be sustainable.
Yep.
Yes, we will have ups and downs in our economy, and we've got to make certain that school districts are able to access pre-approved tax rates by voters.
Predictability.
Right.
And back to this question of Senator West of it being a politics problem as much as an economics problem. The fact is the voters last time delivered a message to this legislature, cut the crap and fix public education, and we're putting you in timeout for 2 years, and if you don't fix it, we're coming for you in 2020, right? And so
they're not coming for him.
I don't know why they would come for me.
They're not coming for him.
He's almost a Tallarico.
Of course, I mean, exactly, yeah, almost a full Tallarico. No, but I mean it more in the royal you sense. They're coming for the royal you. And the fact is, the elected officials in our legislature who heard that message have gotten on the same page as far as this being the issue. Presumably, if they stray from that in another cycle, the voters would similarly come back and deliver the same message.
Elections have consequences.
Elections have consequences. Emily.
Okay. Speaking of funding, we have a question from Lauren on Facebook. Do we have a number for how much the state is losing in tax revenue through business property tax giveaways? Is there any plan to recapture more of this revenue to support public education in perpetuity or any other new revenue sources?
Todd, do you want to advocate for raising taxes on business?
I'll give you a quick example. We just had a $150 million annual tax increase approved by Dallas, 60% of the taxes paid by business, and they raised $600,000 to sell the campaign to tax themselves. Yes, because if they believe in the strategies and the results, they'll fund it.
So is that related to commercial and industrial appraisals being below what the reality of those appraisals should be, and so we should reset those appraisals so they pay more in the form of property taxes that then goes to public education, or are we talking about something else entirely?
Well, I mean, whether you reduce exemptions or you increase the rate, the question is whether or not they're willing to pay more money.
Senator West, Representative Bernal, politically, is it sellable to the business community that they should take one for the team here and give up some exemptions that they may no longer need?
I think that what Todd just says is exactly clear. As long as the business community can see that there are strategies in place that frankly impact their business in the future, they'll be supportive.
Yeah, but you know that closing a loophole equals raising a tax.
Well,
Right.
if they're not paying a tax, closing the loophole isn't raising the tax, it's applying the tax. And I've always been a sales disclosure guy also. So,
Right.
but I do agree, it'd be a much easier sell if we can get them on board with what we're doing and show that it works. If they feel like they're contributing to something real and not just symbolic, then it might be an easier sell.
Right.
Emily.
So if people are not opposed to spending more money and they want to see return on that investment, can we agree on some sort of objective and reliable measure to determine how well money has been spent?
Nicole, how would you want to be held accountable for the way that you're spending your money? I mean, really, that's what it gets down to. If we're going to give you all this money, tell us how you'd like us to judge whether you've been successful.
I mean, I think it's going to take a combination of different measures to indicate success. What I fear is sort of a single measure or one low measure. I think there's a lot of ways to determine student progress. I think it needs to be differentiated because many of our students progress at different rates. I also think that there are financial accountability measures in place that will ensure that we're spending taxpayers' monies wisely. And politics has relevance at every single level: state level, federal level, local level.
Right.
And so you can't ignore that. So accountability needs to be placed. Accountability measures needs to be there, full and wide.
So on the financial accountability side, this is when every smart-ass journalist in 2019 brings up La Jolla Independent School District and the water park.
And why did you do that?
Well, you know, I mean, because the extreme case is always the case that we point to because we're jerks. But so you all should not be in the business of spending the money that you get now on stuff that seems to the taxpayer to be out of your lane.
So I think that's a decision that the local taxpayers need to be able to answer, right? I mean, they, in many regards, that's why we have the systems that we have in place to make sure that there's accountability to taxpayers, and you have to prove up your case. Certainly, I think that's an extraneous case.
Although water parks are nice, TBH, right? I mean, we like water parks.
I think it's, personally, it's a bit of a scope creep, but certainly those.
Do you think?
Hey,
really?
The taxpayers, we have to do a lot of work to sell our bond proposals to our taxpayers. They
sometimes don't even do it successfully.
Exactly. They voted down. But this time we prevailed in a way because we had a plan. And what I know from Austin taxpayers, when you have a solid plan that they believe in, they support the strategies, they'll support you. If you don't do your job and really telling the voters how you expect to use those dollars, how you're accountable for it, they'll vote it down. Yeah. And so who am I to judge a local taxpayer community who says, hey, we have some gaps here and we need to satisfy these gaps? But
don't worry,
it is
I'll
extraneous.
Judge. You don't have to judge. I'll be happy to judge. That's how I roll here. Okay, Emily.
Sure. So regarding outcomes-based pay for teachers, how would teachers of electives like music or athletic programs be included in this?
Mr. Merit Pay, what do we say about that?
I would just say that it has to be locally developed. There are lots of examples around the state where teachers who teach those subjects, probably much more of their evaluation is based on peer review, is based on student experiences, is based on principal observation, because there's not as much, there's really not student achievement to talk about. But at the end of the day, to not be able to understand who your best teachers are and to provide the professional development that they need, he or she needs based on that development, is a disservice to teachers.
And you accept the fact, again, because I saw some nods in the audience when we mentioned this earlier, that if you're going to do pay for performance, you have to figure out a method for non-instructional staff other than librarians. I believe librarians are in.
Whatever you do has to be.
Thing.
Whatever you do has to be viewed as fair. If it's not, they'll leave.
But it has to be everybody. I mean, Nicole said, and I think there's some absolute truth to this, that the non-instructional staff are a critical component of every school district's work. And if you don't understand that and reward those folks, then you're only solving half the problem, right? Yep. But the question is, how do you provide pay for performance in cases where it's less obviously quantifiable?
I think it's subjective judgment of lots of adults in that building, including the students, also through student experiences, to give that feedback. But it's got to be locally developed.
Yeah. Take one more, Emily.
Should there be an increase in the sales tax rate or some other tax formula change in this session, or if not in this session, in the future, to help fund public education?
Is that a topic of conversation we should be entertaining?
It is. I struggle because sales tax is a touchy issue, I think, both in partisan ways and in real life ways.
Well, it's regressive, right? It's a regressive tax.
It is. I mean, luckily, when we're talking about tax exemptions, we've got groceries and utilities that are exempted from that. But
right.
I'm also an anything for education guy. And so to the extent we can find a way to add a revenue source that goes to education that really makes it better, I think it's at least a conversation we have to have. Am I sold on it?
Legal marijuana? Legalize marijuana, tax it, and put the money into public ed?
I don't have a problem with that.
Well, the fact is that the Texas Tribune did polling on this not long ago, and the number one answer that came up among different answers proposed to the public, 60% supported the idea of legalizing marijuana, taxing it, and funneling the money into public ed.
It won't happen this session, that's for certain. But
I mean,
it's not a bad idea, though.
I mean, the reality is, the last time I did a study on that, Colorado was capturing about $250 million in taxes from it.
Right.
And that's been a few years ago. So why not make certain, not like the lottery, that it is in fact
what about the governor at one point floated diverting oil and gas severance taxes out of the rainy day fund in part and putting that into some kind of long-term educational fund? What do you think about that?
I think it's great, but I hadn't heard that lately.
Well, the fact is that if it's not a terribly sustainable deal if the price of oil and gas is so volatile, it doesn't always provide you with a reliable stream of revenue. Okay.
Right.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. We are out of time in our first panel. What a great way to kick off the day. Please thank Representative Bernal, Ms. Conley Johnson, Senator West, and Mr. Williams. We will be back shortly with our next panel. Thanks very much.